Hello and welcome to episode 2 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast where I speak to the authors of some of our most talked about recent pieces. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Coming up this week, I speak with Ben Pyle on the successes of right-wing populist parties at the recent European elections and what that means for the EU's net zero agenda. Charlotte Gill on the madness of taxpayer-funded woke waste, and Dr. Noah Karl on the Lancet's worrying embrace of gender ideology. And for those of you donating at least £5 a month to the Daily Sceptic, we've got a bonus interview this week with Molly Kingsley, founder of Us For Them, on the infected blood scandal and its lessons for the COVID vaccines. If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month to the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. Now, it was the European Parliament elections this week, and one of the big stories was that the Green parties took a bit of a drubbing amid a large populist wave. Yeah! And this will obviously have implications for net zero, in particular in the continent, as well as the politics of the EU more widely. So I'm pleased to be joined now down the line by Ben Pyle, who's going to tell us a little bit more about that. So, Ben, to begin with, can you just give us a general overview of what's taken place at the European elections this time?
Yeah, certainly. So I think what a lot of people were expecting was going to be a radical, the emergence of the radical right asserting itself throughout Europe. Now, of course, that has happened to some extent at the national level, but at the European level, this hasn't really happened. There's been something of a consolidation of the centre, the sort of European centre-right in the form of the EPP, which has gained a few seats. The radical right parties, the ID party, has gained a few seats, and a lot of this seems to have happened at the expense of the radical Greens. This has been quite a disappointing result, I think, for people who were expecting or either hoping for something to knock the consensus out of European politics. Certainly with respect to immigration and net zero, so where that's been changed, I think is obviously in France and in Belgium, where there have been this. Well, in the case of Belgium, the European elections coincided with a federal election, which caused all sorts of turmoil. And in France, of course, this has been quite an embarrassing result for Macron, who wants to now sort of go and try and test the public's appetite for a strong and stable government, or conversely give Marine Le Pen's party the poison chalice of power, if you like, to see, if the public can be dissuaded from appointing her as the next president. So there are sort of very national, regional differences to the European picture. The other thing that I was really struck by was the fact that whereas in the 2019 European elections, there was a real consolidation of the Green vote, and it was called the Green Wave, but it was very, very, very localized as well. It was sort of the mainstays of the European Union. It was France and Germany, and even in Britain, the Green Party, the EFA, did really quite well. Sort of almost doubling, I think, the number of seats, but that's gone. I mean, so there's quite catastrophic losses for a group of that size in both France and Germany and a couple of others. I think they were sort of kicked out of one or two countries, but then their support is sort of become more diffuse. So a couple of the countries that aren't in necessarily or counted as Northwest Europe, more towards the centre, more towards the Mediterranean, they picked up a few seats here and there in one or two or three or four countries, but overall they're quite far down. So this really and this is like the mystery to me has always been, why does a party that polls so badly seem to dominate the ideological agenda of Europe and of course the European countries. All the governments of Europe have seemed hell bent on really quite aggressive climate policies for quite a long time, and so this seems to say, if people are capable of reading polls, this has become less and less interesting to the public where those agendas have really been championed. It remains to be seen how, whether von der Leyen or whoever forms the next presidency of the European Council, whether they take any notice of that, whether they're kind of capable of reading these votes. I mean, of course, historically, they're not very good at listening to the public, whichever way the vote is expressed. I mean, there's a lot to talk about in that, but I'm sure we'll come on to that. Overall, I think it's kind of been a bit of a disappointing picture for many who were expecting some kind of historical decision or another. It wasn't an earthquake, and I think there are some signals that can be pulled out of there, anti-immigration and climate change, but they're not overwhelming. And it looks like the centre may hold for the time being.
So obviously we've seen, significant anti-net zero protests and political movements in recent years in Europe. So there's been the Gilets Jaunes is one. There've been all the farmers' movements descending on various European capitals. But it sounds like what you're saying there is that mostly it's going to be back to business as usual in Europe. So I'm just going to put to you a quote by Ursula von der Leyen, who's the head of the European People's Party and will likely be still returned as, not that she's actually voted for directly, but in any case, she'll become the next president of the European Commission. And she has said the following: "We won the European elections. We are by far the strongest party. We are the anchor of stability. There remains a majority in the centre for a strong Europe. In other words, the centre is holding." So is she right in this? Will it just be business as usual for the next 5 years in Europe?
Yeah, and I mean, Europe is a huge place. It's a electorate of, well, it's not quite an electorate of 500 million people, but it's certainly the European bloc holds that many people. And all these sort of fights like the farmers' protests in Germany and Belgium and France, no matter that they're in those countries, and the yellow vest and so on, then it's going to take quite a long time for those to be broad European political movements and to coalesce essentially and fight its way to those corridors. So there's no and they're starting from scratch in many cases, and they don't necessarily agree with each other. These sort of right of centre parties. You can get all kinds of people in these, all kinds of views into these groupings. European groupings are famously, they're at odds with each other internally. I mean, even the EPP is riven through with people who don't really want to see Ursula von der Leyen be the president. So there's all this trading that needs to be going on. But anyway, the point is about the reconciliation of all these differences. So I think it's always been a case that the presidency, as much as the groupings within the European Parliament and the European Council itself, is just all of this trading and all of this fudging, and of course it's huge amounts of money that keeps the whole thing cohesive. It's the glue that sticks everything together. There's an awful lot of power and a lot to be gained by this. So there's always some quid pro quo that's able to sort of serve as this glue. But the tensions I say the centre will hold, but there are very much different and much greater pressures on the presidency and on the council and the parliament today than there were, for example, 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, in the 2000s, it was, a lovely time for the Eurocrats and the policy wonks, and they all got together and decided what do they want to do next, and there was nothing really stopping them. But now, the crisis, in a sense, is on the cards for the project itself, because Ursula von der Leyen, if she is the next president, that problem of the far right that criticism of immigration and net zero is not going to go away. And the more she's sort of forced into pandering to the S&D group and the Renew Europe group, the more she's going to alienate the people on the other side, right? It's going to be harder and harder to form those consensuses if stuff like net zero is part of the settlement that the consensus that's required to build that the coalition. So what worries me is that what's going to happen is a lot of these political institutions and these politicians really have bought into this idea that we've discussed on the Daily Sceptic quite a lot, that the reason there are people who disagree with net zero and the reason that there are farmers who send their tractors to cities and the reason there are yellow vests on the streets is because of misinformation on social media. Which is ludicrous when we really sort of think about it, because a farmer sort of risking days of wages and presumably the tractor itself, and they're not cheap vehicles, right? The idea that a farmer is going to take that risk because he read something on Twitter is preposterous. He's got much better things to do, and that's called making food, right? And similarly with the rest of these organizations and these new political movements, people aren't just coalescing around ideas which are false, but that's the way that this extremely powerful political institution thinks it's going to be able to cope with that growing political tension. Again, it might not be decisive tension right now, but it can only grow, and that will add more dynamic to that tension if they're just going to institutionalize that intransigence and say, oh, you've read something on Facebook that's false, and here's our remedy for that. We're either going to close your social media accounts down, or we're going to take away, do the debanking stuff that Toby's doing a lot of work on. These are the only instruments that the European Union types really think they have at their disposal, because heaven forfend that they should lower themselves to actually sort of debate these things and take these issues as people want to present them at face value. You can't do it, and that's why we have this idea. That's why the idea is out there that these groups are far right, and these sort of historical allusions emerge. These comparisons with 1930s Germany and so on and so forth. Routinely comparisons with these completely incomparable events. I mean, what most people are arguing for most of the time is some form of democratic representation, which they don't feel the European Union is capable of delivering. So they'll convince themselves that what they're doing is democratic. That is to say, the European Council and the President. But really, she can't. Ultimately, there must be some residual awareness of it. But how this plays out, yet to be seen. I understand that there has been some sort of discussion about who will form the next coalition, but not. We don't know how that's going to turn yet into an agenda with respect to net zero.
One notable feature of the coverage of this election is that there are parties that have been gaining massive increases in their vote share across various European countries, and they continue to be called far right by the media and often by their political opponents. One of the strange things about that is that one of the key issues that they all differ from the mainstream European establishment from is on net zero, as we've been talking about. And yet that doesn't really seem to fit neatly into the standard idea, the typical idea of far right, which is that it's sort of neo-Nazi, it's kind of militaristic, it's to do with political violence. This is simply opposing an energy policy and something that's favoured by EU elites. So initially it seems a little bit bizarre that these people are being called far right in this way, and I wonder how sustainable will that be in future if they continue to gain popularity in this way.
I think the tendency, the desire of a lot of these Eurocrats, who are kind of utopian at the same time as being sort of wonkish technocrats. I think, first of all, they need a crisis. They need a sense of crisis to drive their political project, because it's not like the European Union isn't a project like, for example, democracy, British democracy, or British institutions of democracy, born out of political settlements in the past, or the American Constitution, for example. It's not born out of a conflict or a crisis, which is sort of like specific locality and history, and a series of settlements behind it as such that were demanded by the circumstances of the moment, right? It's always this sort of like, wouldn't it be great if we, it's almost like science fiction. Let's build a massive block of political countries together, and there's no real language for them to understand, therefore, outsiders to that process. Or it's like, how could you so they need sort of to borrow from history, in a sense, from crises and players from crises, to sort of animate that kind of morality play, because they're not playing with straight bats, and they're not talking honestly about what they want to do, what the project really involves, and so the kind of the debate. I mean, it's such a interesting ecosystem, in a sense. It's a political experiment to see how this has happened. Anyone could have told you 15, 20 years ago or longer. I was involved with, UKIP and so on, who were making these kind of arguments at least that far back. Anyone could have told you the building of this really large political organization is going to alienate people, is alienating people, and those people are going to ultimately find their way of organizing themselves to be represented in that process, because they weren't represented ab initio in the way that they are through, in historical political settlements. So we see that, when you take a look at these far right organizations, they have had all the edges knocked off them. They're not marching in the street with jackboots and geometric symbols. The only people marching in the street with geometric symbols at the moment are the Extinction Rebellion and its franchises, right? These organizations are very much more professional, very much better at talking to people, and the mythology that the European Union and its commentators and its wonks try to deploy in its favour against those criticism is just wearing thinner and thinner and thinner. And sometimes people will offer the view that this or that organisation is far right, but then it's very difficult for them to substantiate that when they're challenged. When they're confronted with what the actual arguments are, or more likely, they're confronted with the problems of the policies that have their origins in Europe. They may make the decision, well, okay, then if that's far right, then I'm far right. If we're just going to play fast and loose with these terms, if the cat fits, right? It's very easy to be ethical and to have qualms about political terms like far right and who you want to be in bed with, when everything's working out for you, when you've got plenty of money in the bank, when you've got a car or two and you've got no fear for your job, and no concerns for your children's future. When your job is at risk, when you aren't being able to pay the bills, which are rising throughout Europe because of all of the different crises that climate and energy policies, of course, among other things, right? That starts to change political stakes, and you can't that doesn't wash, that doesn't rub in the same way as it did when you were able to meet your mortgage repayments. It's so, it's silly to think that you can just use these pejoratives indefinitely But I mean, I think that's why we have seen the development of these sort of censorship blob organisations. These sort of how do I describe them? They've sort of set themselves up, often using AI as a service to as sort of as services to these kind of political organisations, not just the European Union, national governments as well. And you know they offer the ability to analyze social media traffic. You know, and where are the nodes on this? You know, how do you identify who are the movers and the shakers in the system, and then you know what they're saying. But these analyses are extremely shallow. I mean, they get paid millions and millions of pounds for it, but the analysis is the top line analysis. Despite all the AI and despite all of this immense amounts of data acquisition, at the end, all they do is they slap just words like far right and misinformation onto it, almost in this very, very casual way. You know, and that should, you know, that should concern anyone who has sort of how do I say it, a more historical or intellectual approach to understanding politics and political movements and what political positions are actually about. If you don't know what an enemy is or an opposition is, right, then all that's going to happen is you're going to project all of your bizarre fantasies into that enemy, into the illusion of that enemy, and it is an illusion. It's an illusion that's created by these AI algorithms, right, with these silly labels slapped on top of them, and so ultimately these phantoms are just going to sort of turn into smoke, and people are going to realise that they've been and fed a big lie by the likes of the European Union wonks, or of course the European Union can get more draconian, and it can start really applying the censorship legislation that it wants to. Then we'll find out who the far right are. Then we'll find out who the fascists are, right? You know, but until that happens, I think there's sort of they're going to be playing it bit by bit by bit. I think we've still got some room for, you know, still got some ability to make our interventions, to make our arguments in Europe and here. So I don't think we should get too scared about it being closed down right now. But I think we should be wary of slippery slopes and such like. You know, keep our eye on the ball and explain why we think that's wrong.
So thinking about politics at the EU level over the next 5 years now, what are the implications of these elections for net zero? Will it accelerate? Will it stay the same? Will they take their foot off the pedal? What do you think?
So some are of the view that Ursula von der Leyen and the EPP have been trying to water down commitments to net zero, for example, by reversing the ultimate day on which the sale of petrol and diesel cars are banned. I think that's the main sort of contentious net zero policy at the moment, but there are plenty more. But this, I mean, I think that's possible. But Ursula von der Leyen will then have to sort of face the fact that she's done a great big U-turn in front of, you know, not just everyone in Europe, but, you know, she's been posing on the world stage as a sort of a leading net zero advocate and sort of trying to push the rest of the world and persuade the rest of the world to come along with this.
In less than 3 decades, we have to reach net zero.
As if European countries themselves weren't already a really big advert against net zero policies. I mean, Germany's experiment with, you know, energy vendor is all but, you know, catastrophic at the moment. You know, and that's of course led to the problems for the German government, which is you know, the Greens are a partner of in that coalition, and that's you know that's having big consequences throughout Europe. So there may be some appetite for that. I mean, maybe it's quite possible that it could be played. Look, this is our experience with radical environmentalism. It's put these targets, these emissions reduction targets, far ahead of anything that that's sort of practical, pragmatic. Rishi Sunak's famous formula, or perhaps not quite famous, but I think it was pragmatism before ideology. So they could try and play that trick, but I guess that really depends on what the other partners in the coalition are going to expect by way of quid pro quo for their confidence and supply, or whatever you want to call that arrangement. And I guess it depends on how strong, of course, the people pulling on the other side are going to be concerned, how they're going to be able to mobilize their own forces and energies. I mean, we can say that radical environmentalism is at least a dead duck on the floor for the time being. But even the EPP has been quite radical in the past. It produced this monster, Connie Hedegaard. I don't know, maybe she's a bit before your time. I think she's the old DG for energy and environment, or climate, or some such. There's been other figures like this breathing all sorts of fire and brimstone environmentalism from the centre in Europe, from the political centre, arguing for targets, trying to bring this Green New Deal to a close more rapidly than most European countries are capable of delivering it. So it's not clear to me that we have really found much difference between the radical environmentalists and the centrists in Europe. But maybe that's just sort of been the consequences of all this quid pro quoing over the years, and there's some reality to it. It would be nice to know what the principles are of a U-turn or a mild rollback. At what point does net zero target based policy become of secondary importance to, when does that get put behind the public interest, the costs that are caused by all this green policy? When does the public interest get put first? I think it'd be fascinating to know and to see how those arguments play out. But and then I think it would be also interesting to see, well, once you've started rolling back once you've done a sort of little bit of a U-turn, do you become more practiced at U-turns? Then do we get a series of? I mean, it'd be lovely to see this as well. But there is still no major force for climate skepticism or climate policy skepticism acting on her, or the drag, if you like, the dynamics acting on any future coalition, which maybe moderates, let's say, its position on net zero. That's all caused by the internal failures of the net zero and climate agenda so far. None of it's caused from outside. None of it's caused by climate skeptics. None of it's caused by the far right. It's all to do with the fact that it's quite a crazy agenda to begin with. It's irrational. It has no idea. There's no idea about how it can really be implemented. It's what happens when you get people in lofty ivory towers thinking about what kind of utopia they would like us to experience and pay for, and reality, be that technical reality, economic reality, or political reality, are kind of afterthoughts. Like democracy, we'll work out democracy later, and all we need to do is to make the technology arrive, is send the right signals to the market. That's how these people think. They think there's a lever. You can pull a lever, it creates some financial incentive, and then someone's going to come up with a battery that can do everything that cannot be currently done just by this incentive. So I think that's where that's what we're going to really see over the next few months and years. And I think that's going to be as interesting as it is terrifying. But we'll let's take it one step at a time too, and dismantle it as it arrives. on the pages of the Daily Sceptic.
Ben Pyle, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Now, have you ever wondered how all this woke madness we see all the time is being funded? I'm pleased to be joined now by Charlotte Gill, who's got the receipts. Welcome to The Sceptic, Charlotte.
Thank you for having me, Laurie. Delighted to be here.
So you've written a piece for us this week called Taxpayer-Funded Trigger Warnings, and you've also got a similar series on your Substack called Woke Waste, where you expose a lot of this, and you've done a lot of similar work for The Telegraph. Why do you think this kind of thing is a subject that's very important to report on?
Yeah, to give you the background of how I got into woke waste, it mainly comes from efforts I used to make to get a book deal. I really had this idea that I wanted to be an author in the past, and I kind of noticed over the years of pitching that the requirements were becoming more based around identity, sort of wanting people deemed marginalised, which normally means ethnic minority, some sort of gender identities such as non-binary, that sort of thing. And I wasn't really going to fit into those categories, with the caveat that obviously I don't have the God-given right to get a book deal. It might just be rubbish as well. But the point is that there's this secondary layer which is about identity, and it's almost become the primary layer through which you're first filtered before they get to the work. So I wrote about this for The Telegraph. That was the first news piece I'd ever done. And I got a taste for it, really. And I soon started, I was really lucky, The Telegraph gave me my break there. And then I started looking into the funding. Something I've always wondered as well is how is all this woke stuff surviving? Because I can't see, people say go woke, go broke. You see in the private sector that it doesn't go down very well. But how is all this other stuff functioning? And I soon just realised that a lot of it, in general, I have a rule in my head that if something looks bad and like audiences don't want to see it, it's probably true. And there's probably a reason for that, which is that it's subsidised. So it's not actually being buffeted by proper market forces. And I have started mapping out, it's been a really long investigation, but I've started mapping out a structure. It's been a learning exercise for me as much as other people I'm sharing it with via Substack and The Telegraph, because our systems, our economy is so opaque. There's so many different channels and routes through which taxpayer cash flows. Most people will have never heard of the bodies handing out billions, like huge amounts of money to causes that, in my opinion, can be quite pernicious. There's largely, I would say, the three main ones that I focus on are local governments, so the devolved governments, the UK Research and Innovation, that's sponsored by the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, and that gets huge amounts of money. It gets something like 25 billion, and that channels all through the universities handing out grants to these really woke, ultra woke projects. And then there's also Arts Council England, which has 445 million in public funds to spend a year, and also hands it out to a lot of woke projects. I think it's really important to know about for the taxpayer. Number one, because we keep hearing that we're going through a very austere period and that we're really affected by Tory austerity. And in my opinion, this is a big fat lie. There is no such thing, at least not if you work in the state sector. There's just a lot of money going around, frankly. And I also think that it is not good for British society and Western society. You have, in my experience, so I'm sort of formulating different rules in my head now when I look at funding. And one thing I generally find as a principle is that the government is always saying one thing and funding the opposite. The government can be saying, we want to go tough on this gender ideology, we need to get rid of it in schools. But then if you go through the charity commission, so a register of charities for England and Wales, you will find examples of charities that are putting the opposite message, and they are receiving taxpayer money, whether directly through the government or local government, which is the government's problem because it just dishes out all this money. So it's not it's, in my view, I almost feel slightly anarchistic about the general election, because how can you vote for something when, unbeknown to you, your taxpayer money is being used to fund the opposite and you don't get a say? It just makes a mockery of democracy, in my opinion.
Indeed. And obviously, we've had a Conservative government for the past 14 years, and they do occasionally make anti-woke noises. I mean, someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg will often declare war on wokery in Whitehall, and they've even got a common sense minister. But it doesn't seem like they've got much of a handle on this kind of thing. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, if I'm honest, I'm not completely sure, because like, one really useful experience is, say, being a SPAD to an MP and just seeing firsthand how Parliament functions. I do think MPs are managing the brief of the job. The scope is too wide, in my opinion. They've got to deal with potholes and international conflicts. So they are dealing with an enormous amount of stuff. But I also think there's obviously a problem with the civil service, because they're constantly putting money into, for instance, I found there was a company that released a newsletter on behalf of the civil service, and it was a diversity company, and it was using the Napoleonic Wars to prove how queer people always existed. I mean, it was just ridiculous. So I followed up to the civil service. They would not give me a straight answer. And eventually, instead of giving me a straight answer, they gave me a link showing contracts that they had with a diversity recruitment firm. And they tendered out, like, it was over hundreds of thousands. And obviously, they're just doing completely the opposite thing. So I think there is a lot of, there are some really good MPs and ministers. I really like Kemi Badenoch and Miriam Cates, for instance, because I think they get a lot of things. But I think there's a problem with internal battles in the civil service, and it's very difficult to control what they're up to. And I think there's another problem with egoists in the Conservative Party and otherwise, just people that want all the glory of being an MP but aren't really interested in the nitty-gritty. I think generally we could do with upping the pay of MPs, and also tightening regulations. To go a bit on a tangent, but I think they should have regulations on what second jobs they can do, because some of them are working they have registered interests, they're taking income from companies that also go against the taxpayers' interests. So I think that's a secondary problem. But ultimately, I'm just amazed. I mean, I am actually amazed that there's been no regulation of some of these issues, no one looking. I don't believe in citizens' assemblies, but part of me does think that you could put taxpayers in some pubs over the course of weeks and they could come up with a few lists of what we could cut and save the country billions overnight.
So you mentioned UK Research and Innovation, which is handing out a lot of these grants, and that's funded by the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, something like this. And, when people hear these terms, they might be expecting it to be funding research in the hard sciences, something about nuclear power or something like that. But it sounds like instead a lot of their money is actually going towards various woke projects. So could you give us an idea of the scale of the money that's being wasted here?
Yeah. So with the UKRI, they're spending about, so just to reiterate, because lots of people don't know what it is, including me until very recently. The UK Research and Innovation, they're spending about $9 billion a year.
UKRI is already investing millions in funding for new renewable fashion and advanced ceramics that builds on regional...
And that is going into all sorts of universities, and it is funding cutting edge science. But then what's interesting is you go on the blog site of the UKRI, and it will be showing off about the important science. It'll be like, look, it tells you a lot about what elements of it aren't actually good, because it shows off certain branches, the bits dealing with, say, leukemia. But then the worst branch of it, I would say, is the Arts and Humanities Research Council. If it was up to me, I would totally defund it.
We have awarded grants for research spanning more than 50 different subjects, from those you might expect to those you might not. Like big data,
to give you an example of how bad it is, at the moment I am doing a very long look into all the studies that have decolonise in their title, so either in the body of the study or the title. And I didn't realise, but colonise can mean other things in a scientific context. So it's not. So there are some studies that are generally talking about like plants and other areas to do with the scientific version. In like the British colonial rule sense, there are like tens, maybe even hundreds of studies relating to that, but they're not. Obviously, it's an important area of history, and I'm not saying don't study it in that regard, but they're using it as a verb, and I've been combing through. So there's over 300, almost 400 active studies with this word in them. So I'm going through, getting rid of the ones that aren't to do with colonial rule, and I'm trying to find out what these people mean by that word. And it's just gobbledygook. It's just. All it means is and the areas they're trying to decolonize, like someone's doing, okay, I'll give you examples. I've got a list here, like decolonizing fashion and textiles designed for cultural sustainability with refugee communities. And that's got 200,000 of taxpayer money.
There is a need to decolonize such dominant practices, really showing how much we can learn from refugees in terms of cultural sustainability and community resilience.
And it's, in my opinion, totally meaningless gobbledygook. Another, the future of Indigenous rights and responsibilities, ancestral governance, environmental stewardship, language revival, and cultural vibrancy. That's £300,000. And they just go on and on. There's a lot of studentship, so that tends to be the early researchers decolonising. Someone's trying to decolonise the city of York. You then have people trying to do it to cities, to photography, to psychology, like you name it. Someone is trying to decolonize it, but none of them can explain what they actually mean, because I've gone through a lot of the methodology. And it's just, I think what they're doing is they are using, what they tend to do is they use words that are sensitive. You know, it's referring to a sensitive bit of history that people are worried about saying something wrong in. They use it as protection from scrutiny, because then if you criticise it, it'll be like, oh, do you not care about British colonialism and what it did? And do you support? And it makes you reluctant to engage. But sorry, off on a bit of a tangent there. But yeah, so UKRI is one, and art's the most, when I publicise this on X, formerly known as Twitter, that's the one that gets the most amount of like sort of laugh or cry reactions. The other wing, Arts Council England, the problem with them is they have investment principles which essentially financially incentivize woke. There are 4. 2 refer to the quality and ambition of the work, and the other are about diversity and environmental responsibility. So in order to get funding, this 445 million in funds and like loads of different versions of it, like grants, direct funding, artists have got to prove somehow, which obviously makes them more incentivized to. The example I always give is, I saw a dancer who said he was converting his dance moves into renewable energy. You can just see how it just produces really ridiculous art. And then, local government is just as bad. They're always complaining about austerity cuts and how they're really suffering because of the Tories. But then you look at some of the things they're funding. My council, Islington, and Camden Council were funding an LGBTQ plus charity, hate crime charity. And when I looked into the actual work that they were doing to fight this hate crime, one of its activities was kayaking sessions for the LGBTQ plus community, called Rainbow Paddlers. And like, this isn't the main function of councils. In my view, they always seem to prioritise social justice vanity projects over the real nitty-gritty of what councils are meant to do. I do think it presents an enormous problem for taxpayers. I almost feel like I've gone down a vortex, and each vortex produces more vortexes. And I sort of, it's a little bit scary, because I don't really see our economy doing particularly well until we dismantle, to borrow a social justice term, or just defund all these different elements. And Labour's not going to do that. And I don't know what's going on with the Conservatives, but they need to get their ducks in a row before going for this.
Yes, I mean, it almost sounds like we need to decolonize the public sector from the decolonizers. But just in terms of that, if you were in government, if you're a political party, how would you go about getting rid of some of this stuff?
Yeah, first of all, it sounds really stupid, but I would be decisive. One of the government's issues is it kicks the can down the road for a lot of difficult areas, purely because the woke lefties are going to kick off by ordering reviews. It almost exports the difficult challenge of saying no to these people to someone that's going to do an obscure review. So Dame Mary Archer, Geoffrey Archer's wife, is currently doing a review into the Arts Council England. It's been paused because of the election. But why get her to do this review? If I was government, I would say, I'm in charge. And Arts Council England, I don't like the way you do things. I'm defunding you. We're going to decide what our best institutions are. And we're going to make some grants. And they're going to be purely decided on ambition, quality, and none of this extra stuff. We're just going to get down to basics. So first of all, defund. Second, and I would also defund the Arts and Humanities Research Council, because the majority of it is just, in my opinion, utter rubbish. And also, if we really are living under austerity, we should be getting back to basics. That means scrapping things that some people like to do, that's what it means. So I would scrap those two, and then I'd create fines. So I've recently written an article about some methods to get rid of woke. I think one thing is we need a new secular charter. I think we think too much about secularism in terms of Christianity and traditional religions, like age-old religions, and the separation of the state. But through woke is, whatever you want to call it, it has a set of beliefs and pillars, and it's being treated as neutral, whereas it's making a lot of people feel really uncomfortable in the way they would if a government was, say, endorsing Scientology or any other religion. And I think the government needs to create a list of things that venture into non-secular territory, for instance, publicly funded institutions making staff wear pronoun badges. And if they do not adhere to these rules, it removes funding, and it can either do it through a multiple strike policy. You give them one warning and you've done it again, you're out. And also because the government oversight is really weak, they can't really keep an eye on everything, to create a reporting system so that taxpayers can say this theatre has done something that is a breach of the secular charter. And then basically the main way to get these people less woke is to sort out the money, to punish them financially, or to remove it. And another way, I think we've got to do something about funding from trusts and foundations. When people talk about dark money in our political system, and I'm not accusing these foundations of dark money, but I'm just saying that there's a really big people concentrate a lot on the right in terms of, oh, look at Michelle Monet, is it Mon or Monet, and look at these Tory contracts for Tory mates, and look at who's donated to them. And there's a disproportionate focus on the right and Tufton Street, whereas a lot of left-wing or institutions that say they're independent but sound very left-wing as far as I'm concerned, there's no oversight of their funders. There are a lot of foundations that are meant to be sort of do-gooder, like helping the UK prosper, and aren't we wonderful? But then I can't really name them because I just need to be careful. But when I look into them, I'm sort of like, this is way too much funding for a cause that is dividing society, and I think the government should have caps there, or just ban funders from. They could just, in the way that they decide like terrorist groups, not to sound really extreme, but they could decide groups that in the UK are causing damage and shouldn't have funding from people, and they should just ban their funding. And that's radical, but I think, could solve it.
Well, thanks so much for coming on, Charlotte. And if people want to find out more about your work on this, where can they find you?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on today, Laurie. If people want to find out more about woke waste, they can find my Substack, Gill's Quill, without sounding like a grifter, as the left-wingers like to call righties. Every paid subscription really helps. It really furthers the amount of bandwidth I can give to nosing around and making sure that we're getting value for taxpayer money. So it's Gill's Quill on Substack. And thank you very much for having me on again.
But of course, woke isn't just about rainbow paddlers at left-leaning councils. It's also finding its way into the hard sciences. Now, joining me down the line to tell us more about this today is Dr. Noah Kahl. So welcome to The Sceptic. So Noah, you've written for us this week about the medical journal The Lancet and how it appears to have embraced gender ideology. Now, why is that so worrying that it's in this particular journal?
Yeah, so the Lancet, according to my understanding, is the second oldest medical journal in the world. And it's also the second most prestigious if you rank medical journals by this thing called the H index, which is a measure of basically how much the material in the journal gets cited, therefore how scientifically significant it tends to be. So this isn't some obscure publication that no one really cares about. This is a major journal that's presumably very influential in the medical community. So if it were a far less significant publication, there would be less reason to worry. But it exerts a major influence over the health sector, I presume, in the UK and elsewhere.
So a very important publication then. Can you just give our audience a quick history of the Lancet's woke turn?
Okay, so yes, the Lancet is edited by a man named Richard Horton, and he's been at the helm for 29 years. During which time he has been embroiled in a number of controversies. He was in charge of the journal, I believe, when the Andrew Wakefield vaccine autism scandal happened. And since then, there have been a number of other controversies. Most recently, prior to this latest one, a year or two ago, he penned an editorial in the Lancet denouncing the then Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, for something she said about migration, which was a rather odd thing to do, given that his journal is supposed to be concerned with medicine, and Suella Braverman hadn't said anything about health or medicine. She'd just talked about the values that migrants coming into the UK have, or that she thought they had. And in this editorial, he praised the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, and he called for his fellow progressives to wage a war of position against populists. So, I mean, it was really embarrassing stuff. It was the kind of thing you'd expect to see on a pamphlet for a left-wing student organization, but instead it's in the world's second most prestigious medical journal. So that's the background. Then this latest scandal concerns the author guidelines at the journal. These are basically the guidelines to which prospective authors wishing to submit a paper to the journal consult before they do so, to make sure they've the content of their paper is consistent with what the journal requires. And these guidelines state that sex and gender are different things, and the meaning of sex and gender change, and both sex and gender are on a spectrum. You must not use the term sex, but rather sex assigned at birth. And of course, neither sex nor gender is binary. Basically, all the tenets of what has become known as gender ideology in a supposedly serious scientific publication.
So how much do you think this will affect individual submissions to the Lancet and potential authors?
Well, it's unclear what effect this is going to have on the prospective authors. Some people presumably disapprove of it. Not clear exactly what percentage. Others will approve, because the gender ideology has been surprisingly influential in disciplines where you would have thought the practitioners would know better. But I suspect that some scientists will balk at the new guidelines and perhaps refuse to send papers to the journal. I mean, they do literally state that they expect authors to use the term sex assigned at birth because it's more accurate and inclusive. So presumably, if you're writing a paper for the journal, you'd have to state, of the subjects in our sample, 50% had been assigned female at birth and 50% had been assigned male at birth, rather than just saying our sample comprised 50% women and 50% men.
So to what extent do you think this will compromise research in the Lancet?
In principle, it need not compromise research other than insofar as it gets the basic science on sex in humans wrong. But I guess in principle, you could write a paper with this new jargon that was otherwise scientifically rigorous.
So you said that in some sense this is a superficial change in that people could continue to carry out the same research just using the new jargon. But obviously it is also a bit of a signal of the entrance of gender ideology more generally into the scientific community. So thinking about it more widely, is this a sign of the infiltration of woke into science?
Well, I guess that the guidelines could function as a signal that the journal is not open to submissions that would question aspects of gender ideology or trans ideology. It seems unlikely that if they're asking you to use the term sex assigned at birth, they would be willing to countenance a paper that criticized those two ideologies, those two views on sex and gender. More generally, of course, woke ideology is doing a great deal of damage to science, particularly in areas where there's some hot button issue, whether it's transgender or race.
But so obviously, when it comes to gender ideology, big news recently in Britain was the Cass Review, which really laid out the extent of the failures of medical treatment at the Tavistock Clinic, which was obviously basically in hock to all kinds of gender ideology and the damage that was causing, especially to children. And so do you get a sense that there's a bit of a pushback underway against this ideology in general in the scientific community?
Well, I do see some pushback. I mean, people like heavyweights like Richard Dawkins and Alan Sokal, the latter being the original mocker of left-wing postmodernism in academia. He was the one who wrote a satirical paper called something like Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity, basically making fun of what he regarded as postmodern nonsense in cultural studies journals. So people like him and Dawkins have been writing op-eds for major newspapers, basically reinforcing the conventional correct view that yes, there are a small number of people in the population with so-called intersex conditions whose various extremely rare genetic conditions that disrupt sexual development in one or other way, but the vast majority of people are either men or women, and there are only two sexes in the species Homo sapiens. There's no third or other sex. There are just these unusual genetic conditions that are hard to classify one way or the other. So I do see pushback from people like that. I not aware of any index tracking the scale or influence of gender ideology in medicine, but the new Lancet guidelines are certainly not a sign that things are moving away from that ideology.
Dr. Noah Carl, thanks so much for joining us. That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailysceptic.org/donate.